Sudan's comprehensive peace agreement really didn't deliver the peace and stability dividends that it had sought, because the deal itself was fundamentally a deal of the elites that had neglected to address the root causes of conflict in Sudan. Those root causes are much more closely related to racism and center-periphery dynamics that have been in place since independence and even before. The comprehensive peace agreement was signed on both sides of the border with the sense that the deal would allow both groups of elites in both the north and the south to run their countries unopposed, while also benefiting from their respective economies and, simultaneously ceasing to rock each other's boats. Ultimately, both Sudans remained elite-run kleptocracies. Those leaders and elites have really readily found economic and political reasons to collaborate across the border and keep each other in power. Most particularly, the ongoing need to share oil revenue has bound the elite governments in Juba and Khartoum together, and this has meant that there is every incentive for them to keep each other in power. At the more local level, there's also been simply bad faith and lack of intent and trust in what was the three areas of Abyei, South Kordofan, and Blue Nile along Sudan's border with South Sudan when it came to implementation of the comprehensive peace agreement. There really was never any real intent to allow Blue Nile or South Kordofan to have the popular consultations that they were due in the comprehensive peace agreement, and Abyei has yet to have the referendum that it was promised within the agreement that would determine whether the territory would be associated with the Republic of Sudan or South Sudan. Abyei really is the most prominent of several ongoing land ambiguities between the two in the wake of the CPA. But Khartoum and Juba have really prioritized bilateral stability and peace over addressing the concerns of formerly important domestic constituencies, particularly the Dinka Ngok and the Miseria. Sudan allowing South Sudan to secede was meant to precipitate normalization between Khartoum and the international community, essentially leaving Sudan alone to manage its own affairs after having been heavily sanctioned and having become a pariah state during its ongoing, near 3-decade war with the South, and in the context of other violence in other parts of Sudan's peripheries. Sudan's behavior subsequently in both Darfur and the two areas following the comprehensive peace agreement's conclusion, and its flirting with Iran as well, subsequently brought new censure to the country, however. So they really were never able to get out from underneath the pariah status that had come from from the wake of Khartoum's battle with the South. There were also really concerns about the economic pressures that would come after the oil boom. When South Sudan seceded, obviously oil revenue was removed in the vast majority. Although, on the upside, this has driven new levels of gold exploration in Sudan and therefore a new source of revenue. However, it really has been tough for Sudan to replace the boon that oil had delivered. The agreement also did not solve the country's civil conflicts, because those same issues that precipitated the South Sudanese rebellion, the Anyanya rebellion, there were two of those, those same dynamics were at play in near identical circumstances in other parts of the country, whether that was in South Kordofan or in Blue Nile or even in the east or in Darfur. So Khartoum remained ringed by rebellions and ringed by displeasure of populations who were unhappy at the level of marginalization that was coming from Khartoum. What happened with South Sudan really upset many quarters of Sudan who felt the country should remain as a single entity. They felt the breakup very viscerally and felt that breakup weakened Sudan as a whole and was a blight on the country's history and showed the country's inability to resolve a historical problem. The secession of South Sudan drove sensitivity about South Kordofan and Blue Nile states seceding, and about even the threat of Eastern secession more recently. There have been threats coming out of the East as they've felt left behind by the Juba Peace Agreement, which was signed during the transitional period in Sudan. Many who felt the secession of South Sudan was unthinkable were really newly apprehensive about the further breakup of the country. Sudan's transitional government, comprising both military and civilian forces, was in place for 2 years ahead of the coup. It had stumbled and stuttered forward, with the military really making it very hard, if not even impossible, to govern in this period. The military had blocked a whole array of reforms and attempts to move the country forward. Crucially, the military had signed up to the constitutional declaration with the idea that civilians would indeed fail in their attempts to transform the country, and that the military would then represent a safe pair of hands to receive custody of Sudan as a result. However, the civilians found a level of success in various ways, including removing the United States state sponsor of terrorism designation, getting inflation under control, and addressing Sudan's rampant balance of trade and finding some improvement through economic reforms. The military really was concerned about this new success and was also concerned about the prospect of facing justice for crimes committed both during the Bashir era and subsequently. They were also concerned about losing their hold on the military, and really worked hard to avoid civilians providing Sudanese more broadly with the proof of concept of a democratic context. It has come to me that the military confided in key democratic figures that they had miscalculated, and just weeks after the coup declared or acknowledged the failure of the coup. They were surprised at the level of backlash that they received both domestically and internationally. Even regional backers of the coup in Cairo were shocked at the backlash and expressed that as much to US officials in just weeks after the coup. And of course, seeing the backlash, General Hemeti of the Rapid Support Forces distanced himself from the coup some months later. The coup could have been expected. There were plenty of reasons to suggest that the military were concerned about the trajectory of the country in that transitional period. But I think ultimately, it shows the military was wholly unwilling to simply give up power. They'd been running Sudan for 52 of 65 years since independence and had shown no will to step away from the political and economic power advantages they had built up over that time. Ultimately, the coup itself illustrated a level of bad understanding of the Sudanese context by the military, a bad analysis and bad decision-making. And this is really the crux of why the coup came about. As things stand, Sudan remains deadlocked over its political future. Unfortunately, the African Union and IGAD have been too comfortable with the military's primacy in Sudan, and that has really left the popular demands for democracy by the wayside in favor of really old guard autocracies that provide, as AU and IGAD may see it, a greater assurance of stability. Certainly other regional partners from the Gulf, from Egypt, do show significant preference for a strong role for the military in government, if not entire military control of the Sudanese state. This is really the result of regional interests in the status quo. Unfortunately, the UN compromised its independence and ability to operate with greater principle when it opened the door to the broader trilateral mechanism and the compromised involvement of the AU and IGAD. This really was the result of the UN Secretary General's insistence on application of the UN's mandate to fulfill the principles of subsidiarity. However, the AU has, in the last couple of years, presided over a litany of coups and has shown little will to respond in any meaningful way to push back on those coups. IGAD itself has become a rather ineffectual talking shop in recent years and has no capacity to take any such negotiations forward. In many ways, security sector reform is the transition in Sudan. The military has run the country for 52 of the country's 65 years of independence and has little, ability or interest to adjust their relationship to the state. More to the point, there is little pressure or incentive on the military to reform. They have shown no inclination to engage in that process. Yet there has been, under the surface, quiet consideration of the prospect of security sector reform, albeit this is more as a part of a package of retaining overall power in the country. It is really hard to overstate just how existential an issue security sector reform is for the military. They like aspects of SSR that include improving professionalization and capacity of the security forces, but they do not like the prospect of devolving power to civilians who they do not trust. In fact, General Burhan, the head of the government, confided just days before the coup that he was worried that indeed the civilians would, and I quote, hang us if the civilians got in and removed the military from power. So this showed the level of distrust that happens between civilians and military. The single largest factor in how and whether security sector reform can proceed is the competition between Generals Burhan and Hemeti, the SAF and RSF. This power struggle makes it difficult for either side of the military to reform, as each remains primarily concerned about being weakened in relation to the other. One obvious starting point for demonstrating how security sector reform might indeed work in Sudan is in boosting civilian command and control of the joint forces in Darfur, which are a result of the Juba Peace Agreement and comprise Juba Peace Agreement signatories, the Rapid Support Forces, and the Sudan Armed Forces. An effective modeling of just how civilian command and control could work for these joint forces in Darfur could demonstrate just how those different disparate forces could work together and how civilians could provide working oversight of security forces' decision-making. It is a near certainty that crimes from both the decades of state and security forces abuse that resulted in uncountable deaths, injuries, theft, displacement, and disenfranchisement in Sudan will go unpunished. Even isolated incidents of police brutality in the current context have met impunity, and certainly, during the 2 years of the transitional period, many abuses have gone completely unaddressed. This is a major issue for many of the resistance committees and many civilians across Sudan. As things stand, security forces simply will not hand over power if they are forced simultaneously to submit to any sort of justice. The coup itself took place in part over concerns of the prospects of justice for the security forces. There is some scope for non-punitive justice potentially, but politically minded sections of the military worry about the political impact of submitting themselves to a public forum in which their crimes will come to the fore. So all in all, very little chance of justice in Sudan for the security forces.